on her first visit to survey the car dealership after taking office. Sarah was looked down upon by the manager, Richard, who assumed she was a poor person unable to afford a car. But Sarah Vance is not as simple as she appears. Her true identity will make Richard pay the price. What consequences will Richard's contempt bring? Follow the story to find out. The bright sunlight shone down on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, California, where luxury boutiques and supercars create a scene of opulence. Inside Sterling Luxury Motors, a car dealership catering to the elite, Richard Sterling stood behind his polished mahogany desk, surveying the showroom like a king ruling his domain. At 52, Richard had spent nearly 3 decades in the luxury car business. He wasn't just a manager, he was a gatekeeper, ensuring that only serious buyers left with the keys to one of the high-end cars gleaming under the showroom lights. He had a keen eye for class, for wealth, for who belonged and who didn't. The chime of the glass door rang out as a woman entered. Tall, athletic, in her mid-30s, wearing a simple black leather jacket, ripped jeans, and worn sneakers. Her posture was relaxed, her expression unreadable. She glanced around, taking in the polished showroom floor, the array of luxury SUVs, and the framed awards on the walls. Richard sized her up and decided everything he needed to know, not a buyer. He turned to his sales associate, Sarah, who was curiously watching the woman. "Don't waste your time," he whispered, adjusting the diamond ring on his finger. "She's just browsing." Sarah hesitated but said nothing. They had worked together long enough to know that when Richard made a decision, no one was to question it. But the woman wasn't just browsing. She walked towards the brand new 2024 Range Rover Autobiography. Stopping beside the driver's side door, she ran her fingers lightly along the glossy black paint before turning to survey the showroom. Her eyes locked onto Richard's. Without hesitation, she walked straight towards him. "Excuse me," she said. "I quite like that Range Rover. I'd like to know more about it." Richard couldn't hide a sigh. He had seen cases like this before. People wandering in, hoping to impress someone with a test drive. They had no intention of buying. He offered a perfunctory smile. "That's the fully loaded autobiography model," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "High-end luxury, $165. The woman nodded. "Sounds about right for what I'm looking for." Richard crossed his arms. "Are you familiar with our financing options? A purchase like that requires considerable credit or a down payment." The woman looked him straight in the eye, her expression unreadable. "I won't be needing financing." He tried to smile politely. "I see. If you're serious about buying, we'll need to run a soft credit check before proceeding. It's company policy." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Richard. They both knew that wasn't company policy. But the woman didn't react, didn't get upset, didn't argue. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek black card wallet. "I'd like to test drive it." Richard's expression hardened. "We don't offer test drives on vehicles of that price without verified proof of income," he said smoothly. "You understand." The woman's lips curled slightly, almost as if she had expected this. "Oh, I understand." Richard smirked, unaware of what was about to happen. Sarah stood uncomfortably beside Richard. She had seen him pull this stunt before, turning away potential buyers based solely on their appearance. But something about this woman's demeanor felt different. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't argumentative, she simply observed. Yet, Richard remained resolute. "I'm sorry," he said, offering a polite but distant smile. "But for a vehicle of this value, we cater only to serious inquiries. We've had issues in the past with people wasting our time, taking test drives for fun and then leaving." The woman didn't blink. "Test drives for fun?" Richard continued, though the insincerity was evident in his voice. "I'm sure you understand." Sarah noticed it, the slight shift in the woman's expression. Just for a second, a flicker of something beneath her calm exterior. Not anger, not disappointment, something colder, sharper. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The woman exhaled, nodding slowly. "All right, no test drive. I understand." Richard nodded in satisfaction, already shifting his attention to another customer. An older man in a tailored suit examining a Bentley across the showroom. But before he could completely dismiss the conversation, the woman in the leather jacket spoke again. "What about cash buyers? He glanced back, slightly annoyed. Excuse me? If someone wanted to pay in full, in cash, no financing, no credit check, would that change your test drive policy? Richard almost laughed. People like her didn't buy six-figure cars in cash. I appreciate your enthusiasm, he said, but I'm sure you can understand that we have policies in place for our own reasons. For the first time, a hint of amusement flickered across the woman's face. I understand, she said, slipping her hands into her pockets. So what's the procedure? Richard's smile tightened. I just told you, he said, his patience wearing thin. We require serious and financially capable clients. Our cars are highly sought after. And we can't afford to. I understand. The woman interrupted, her voice still oddly calm. I'm just trying to understand what the standard is. What does a serious buyer look like to you? Silence. For the first time, Sarah saw something flash across Richard's expression. A near imperceptible hesitation before he quickly masked it with a short, dismissive laugh. I think we're done here, he said firmly. If you'd like to browse, feel free, but I have other clients to attend to. Sarah expected the woman to react strongly, perhaps even storm out in anger. Instead, she simply nodded, her lips curving into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. I understand. And with that, she turned and walked away. But Sarah had a feeling Richard had just made a mistake. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't even flustered. Instead, she acted like someone who had just discovered something important. Like someone waiting for the perfect moment to act. Sarah glanced at Richard, who had already turned his attention to the man in the suit examining the Bentley. Business as usual, but across the showroom, the woman in the leather jacket hadn't left. Instead, she was examining another car, a Mercedes-Benz G-Class. Running her fingers along the chrome door handle, tilting her head as if admiring it. Sarah watched as one of the younger sales associates, Kevin, hesitated before approaching her. Hello, ma'am, Kevin said, flashing his most friendly salesman smile. Can I help you with anything? The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. Yes, actually, I was looking at that Range Rover earlier, but I was told I couldn't test drive it unless I proved my finances and was a definite buyer. Is that correct? Kevin blinked. Well, I mean. Before he could stammer a reply, Richard appeared beside him like a shadow. His lips were curved into a polished professional smile, but his eyes were sharp. Kevin, I'll take it from here. Kevin looked like he wanted to say something, but one glance at Richard and he retreated, disappearing towards the reception desk. The woman watched the exchange with quiet amusement. You certainly keep a tight rein on your staff, she observed. Richard's voice hardened. I believe I made it clear. We cater to a specific clientele here. Serious buyers, and we can't accommodate every request. A moment of silence hung in the air. Then, the woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. You know, I've been to a lot of dealerships, she said, rubbing her chin thoughtfully. Some good, some bad, but I've never seen anyone try so hard not to sell me a car. Richard's expression tightened. That's not it, isn't it? The woman tilted her head slightly. Then let's make it clear. I'll write a check right now. Pay in full. No proof of finances needed. Sarah, who had been pretending not to hear from behind her desk, felt her stomach clench. Richard stared at the woman for a long moment, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. He wasn't stupid. If she really had the money, turning her down outright could backfire. But he wouldn't waver, and he wouldn't be proven wrong in front of his team. That's a generous offer, he said, his voice smooth as silk. But as I said, it's company policy. You'll need to provide documentation before we can proceed. The woman looked him straight in the eye for a moment, then slowly pulled out her wallet and opened it. A black American Express Centurion card was nestled inside. Sarah's eyes widened. Richard didn't flinch. The woman let the silence stretch, letting him observe it. Then she slipped the card back into her wallet. No test drive? Richard raised his chin, his professional mask still intact. I'm afraid not. The woman observed him for another long beat. Then without another word, she turned and walked away. But Sarah could see it. Richard had just stepped into a situation he hadn't anticipated. Sarah could feel the weight of the silence in the showroom. Richard stood rigid, his jaw clenched. his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had just turned down a woman who had flashed a Centurion card. A card reserved for the ultra-wealthy. And he still turned her down. Sarah swallowed hard. This was not going to end well. Across the showroom, the woman didn't storm off in anger. She didn't even seem flustered. Instead, she strolled leisurely through the rows of high-end cars. As if she owned the place. She ran her hand over a smooth hood, nodding slightly to herself, almost as if taking notes. Then, the glass door opened, and a well-dressed man, in his mid-50s, with graying hair, wearing a tailored navy suit, entered with an air of authority. His polished leather shoes made barely a sound on the tiled floor. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Michael Vance, the regional director. Richard saw him too. He immediately straightened up, his entire demeanor shifting. "Mr. Vance," he greeted, his voice smooth and professional. "What a pleasant surprise. What brings you here today?" Michael's eyes barely glanced at him. Instead, they were fixed on the woman in the leather jacket. And then his face lit up. "Ah, there you are." Michael approached, extending his hand. "Alexandra, I was just about to call you." Sarah felt the atmosphere in the room change. Richard's face paled. The woman, Alexandra, finally offered a small smile, shaking Michael's hand warmly. "Good to see you too, Michael. I was just looking around." Michael chuckled, patting her shoulder. "I told you, this is one of our best locations. You'll like it here." Richard stiffened, exhaling sharply. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice lower, more cautious. "You two know each other?" Michael turned to him. "Of course." Then, with a broad smile, he gestured towards Alexandra. "Allow me to introduce Alexandra Vance, the new CEO of Sterling Luxury Motors." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Sarah didn't move. Richard's lips moved, but no sound came out. His entire body froze. Alexandra merely observed him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Richard," she said evenly, "you just refused to sell a car to your new boss." The weight of those words sent a shockwave through the showroom. Employees stared, some in shock, some trying to hide their amusement. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew it. She knew something was off. And Richard, for the first time since she'd met him, looked genuinely terrified. The silence in the showroom was heavy, suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard blinked rapidly, his brain trying to find a way out of this situation. This had to be a mistake. A joke. The woman standing before him, the woman he had just humiliated, couldn't be his new CEO. But Michael had said it, in front of everyone. Alexandra let the words sink in before continuing. "I must say," she said thoughtfully, tilting her head slightly, "I was expecting to get a feel for how this dealership operates today." A pause. "I wasn't expecting this." Richard's stomach churned. He had been in sales for over 2 decades. He had handled difficult clients, high-pressure deals, VIPs who expected the world on a silver platter. But this was something else entirely. Michael finally sensed the tension, glancing between them. "Wait, what happened?" Alexandra didn't answer immediately. She let the moment linger, observing Richard like a teacher watching a student about to fail a test. Then, she turned casually to Sarah. "What's your name?" Sarah's throat was dry. Sarah, ma'am." Alexandra nodded. "How long have you worked here?" 4 years. Alexandra chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Let me ask you this, Sarah, if I had walked in here today, wearing a suit, saying the exact same things I just said, would I have had to pull out a credit card just to be taken seriously?" Sarah hesitated. She knew the answer. Everyone did, but saying it could cost her her job. Alexandra seemed to sense her hesitation and nodded slightly. "You don't have to answer." Then, she finally turned back to Richard. He had regained some of his composure, but his usual sharp confidence was gone, replaced by something strained. "Ms. Vance," he began, "I sincerely apologize if there's been any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Alexandra raised an eyebrow. "Is that how you explain it?" Richard tried to force a smile. "I was simply following store policy. We have strict guidelines when it comes to test driving luxury models. I would treat any customer this way." Alexandra observed him, then turned slowly to Michael. "Michael, tell me, When did Sterling Luxury Motors start requiring soft credit checks before a customer can even sit in a car? Michael's eyebrows furrowed. We don't. Richard's last line of defense crumbled. Alexandra observed him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cause a scene. But somehow, Richard felt worse than if she had. Richard's palms were now clammy. And for the first time, he felt it. He had lost control. Richard's throat tightened, his mind racing, searching for an explanation, an escape, anything to reverse the situation. Alexandra tilted her head slightly, observing him with the patience of a victor. So let's be clear, you refused to sell me a car because I didn't look like someone who could afford it. Richard opened his mouth, but Alexandra wasn't finished. You made assumptions. You turned me away. You lied about company policy. And when I called you out, you doubled down. She shook her head slightly. Tell me, Richard, what does a serious buyer look like to you? The words landed like a punch to his gut. Richard struggled to maintain his composure, forcing a strained smile. Ms. Vance, I assure you that was never my intention. We have high standards here, and I was simply ensuring those standards were met. Alexandra cut him off, raising an eyebrow. Richard stammered. Sarah, Kevin, and the other employees stood frozen, watching their manager crumble. Michael cleared his throat, stepping forward. Alexandra, surely this isn't how we want to treat any of our customers. I'm not a customer. I'm the CEO. And I just watched my sales manager decide on the spot who is and isn't allowed to be here. The room fell silent. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He had always acted with an air of invulnerability. He knew this business inside and out, had worked here for years. He had built a reputation for closing deals. But none of that mattered now. Alexandra turned back to him, her expression unreadable. I came here undercover for a reason, to see how our customers are treated. To see if the values we claim to uphold are actually being practiced. She paused, then added, I've seen enough. Richard's chest tightened. I understand your concerns, he managed, his voice trembling slightly, but surely we can talk about this. I've been a valuable part of this company for years. I've closed deals no one else could. My track record speaks for itself. Alexandra observed him for a long moment, then nodded. You're right, your track record does speak for itself. A flicker of hope crossed Richard's face, until she added, that's why you're being terminated. As Alexandra finished speaking, the entire room seemed to plunge into silence. Richard stood there, frozen, everything around him blurring. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Fired? His whisper hung in the still air. The usual sneer on his lips vanished, replaced by utter disbelief. Richard's eyes widened, staring at Alexandra, as if trying to find a sign of mistake. A glimmer of hope. But Alexandra's steady gaze didn't waver. The harsh truth hit Richard like a slap in the face, shattering every illusion of power and invulnerability he held dear. The initial shock subsided, and Richard began to feel anger surge. You can't do this, he growled, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. I've worked here for nearly 30 years. I built this dealership. Alexandra remained composed, but her voice turned colder. You built it, but you don't get to decide who walks through that door. Richard felt like an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. The anger was replaced by despair. He looked around, seeking support from his staff, but they all looked down, no one daring to meet his eyes. He realized, in that moment, he was utterly alone. Please give me a chance, Richard said, his voice trembling. I promise to change. I'll never. But Alexandra raised her hand, cutting him off. It's too late, Richard. Richard looked at Alexandra one last time, his eyes filled with helplessness and bitterness. He knew it was over. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his usual air of pride completely gone. Richard Sterling, the powerful manager of Sterling Luxury Motors, was now just a defeated man, crushed by his own arrogance and prejudice. In the opulent world of Rodeo Drive, Richard Sterling learned a bitter lesson about arrogance and prejudice. His story is not just about losing a job, but about the collapse of an outdated ideology. Alexandra Vance demonstrated that, in business as in life, judging people by their appearance is a fatal mistake. True success lies not in supercars or expensive suits, but in respect and fairness towards everyone. And finally, this story reminds us that sometimes, The most unassuming people are the ones with the greatest power. What do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a situation similar to Alexandra's? How would you have handled it? Let's discuss and share your experiences. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends if you found it interesting and meaningful. And remember to follow me for more captivating stories.